Your Royal Highness, distinguished speakers, students, it's a real pleasure to be here today and talk about sexual and reproductive health. It wasn't too long ago that I was a student myself. I only finished my PhD last year, so there's hope at the end of the tunnel. The first thing that a researcher must do is ask a question. And ideally, we should ask a question where the answer might surprise us. We should question, as the professor in the Faculty of Law here says, Nils Christie. And the question that I want to ask today is the one that was just raised from the benches here. We can come with the right arguments about sexual and reproductive health, moral arguments, health arguments, economics arguments that we've just heard, more consequentialist approaches. But will it make any difference? What makes a difference in actually achieving change on sexual and reproductive health? What explains advancement or regression in sexual and reproductive rights? Why did, for example, Rwanda in 2012 partially decriminalise abortion? It's commonly presumed in African countries that it's very difficult to make advances on abortion for religious and cultural reasons. But we have another number of countries going forward. Why did Mozambique decriminalise same-sex relationships also a few years ago? On the other hand, why did Nicaragua and also El Salvador ban abortions under any circumstances? While most of Latin America is moving forward on reproductive rights, some countries are moving backwards. Similarly, why did Nigeria increase prison sentences for same-sex relations to 14 years? All African common law countries have banned same-sex relationships since the colonial times. It was the British who introduced these laws. But now Nigeria, Uganda, and other countries are going further in enhancing the level of criminalisation. Why do we need to consider the determinants of change? It's a question we need to ask in any area of public policy. But sexual and reproductive rights, and I'm going to use the term rights interchangeably with health, but we can obviously debate whether the two always go together. It's challenging. Why? Because all sexual and reproductive rights challenge gender norms. Same-sex relations, women's reproductive rights, sexual violence, disability sexual rights, they all challenge our existing conceptions of gender, of man and woman. In fact, by introducing even more genders, for example, or changing the relationships between them. Secondly, and politically, conservative groups are generally more united than progressives. So who opposes advances on sexual and reproductive rights most consistently? It's generally conservative religious groups. Who fights for them? Well, then it gets much more scattered. You have the LGBT community fighting for gay and lesbian rights. You have the women's community fighting for reproductive rights and so forth. They tend to be a more split force in terms of power. Thirdly, technical expertise has less traction in moralised debates. If we're going to debate what is the ideal banking policy for Norway or Nicaragua or Malawi, well, how many people in this room know about banking policy? Okay, well, then we're going to leave that to the experts. The economists can come up with an answer. But when we're going to talk about homosexuality, when we're going to talk about abortion, when we're going to talk about domestic violence, then everybody's got an opinion. It makes it harder to bring the expertise and the arguments that all of you have in the room. Fourthly, implementation in the public and private sphere can be easily stalled, partly because of the power of public opinion in these areas. And challenges remain. Here's global rankings of the harshness, for example, on the world's abortion laws. And you see there's a lot of red and orange across the world. But if we used more nuanced indicators to measure progress on sexual and reproductive rights, you would find there'd be more red and orange even in the northern half of that particular map. To give you an example, Amnesty International released a report on maternal health in the United States of America. They found maternal mortality ratios in some parts of the US on par with Africa. These are poor, rural, Afro-American dominated communities in the US which do not receive proper public health facilities. Similarly, we look at lesbian gay rights in the world, we see a lot of red and orange in different parts, but again, if we disaggregate further, we see challenges across the world, most recently in Russia. But also now we've seen constitutional amendments, say in Macedonia, proposed in Slovakia, to prohibit same-sex marriage in the future. We're seeing what we saw in the south of the US, now coming even to Europe. In thinking about theories of change, the determinants of change, we can group all the complex political science, public policy theories into three groups: norms-based, instrumental, and structural. And I'll explain what each of these means. Norm-based theories basically are premised on changing of opinions, and that we act according to what we think, or what sociologists call our collective action frames. And so if we want to change how policymakers behave, bureaucrats behave, how the public behave, we need to change opinion. We need to win arguments. Whether it's on abortion, whether it's on LGBT rights there in Uganda. It may be from below, as you can see from those activists there. It may be from more middle-class activists, as you see in the left-hand corner. Or it may also be from elite actors, including one in this room. So when Crown Princess visited Nicaragua, she generated a lot of attention for LGBT rights by lending her credibility to this particular cause. Other theories of change focus on instrumental approaches. Assume that we're rational, strategic, self-interested actors. Okay? And so money talks, power talks. So the idea with Uganda recently is if we cut aid or suspend loans, whether the World Bank, the US government, even Norway and Denmark, then Uganda might change its position. We use incentives and constraints to move forward this particular agenda. But it also applies at the national level too, for national politicians. Ask, for example, why did Museveni sign into law these regressive new penal practices on LGBT rights? Was it the power of public opinion, which had been mobilised by religious groups, so he wanted to pacify them and satisfy their political preferences as a politician? Or was it even more strategic than that Museveni is losing on other issues, so he wants to position himself to gain more votes by distracting people with this issue? And you can see part of the rise in the anti-LGBT agenda in Africa and also Latin America is partly motivated by these sorts of political strategic calculations. But there may also be deeper structural factors. So the two doctors who were just here also pointed to this in their answer to the question. What are deeper structural factors? Well, they're things like wealth, they're things like religion, they're things like demography. And these sorts of theorists say, well, we just have to wait. I mean, previous speaker was saying we have to wait 200 years perhaps for some change in these areas. So if we look, for example, at a gay rights index and changes over time, we're seeing more decriminalisation of sodomy, the red line, and greater legal equality provisions in different countries across the world. The authors with this index tried to explain this by looking at mostly structural factors, broader factors beyond the field of sexual and reproductive health, the number of women in parliament. Well, this seemed to have actually an effect. A country was 36.6% more likely to decriminalise same-sex relationships if there were more women in parliament, or signing the CEDAW Convention. But interestingly, banning religious parties, for example in Turkey, had the opposite effect. Repressing religion didn't necessarily lead to advances. Now, this study may be wrong, but it may suggest that you need to engage with religion rather than repress it in trying to find advances. GDP per capita was a very influential variable. Common law countries are reversed, partly because of the British colonial laws. Democracy. So if you want to improve sexual and reproductive rights, you might also want to fight for democracy. 44% more likely of having decriminalisation. Other structural factors are poverty, and these are already named. In a case brought to the Nepal Supreme Court dealing with uterus prolapse, a maternal health issue, the petitioners, in citing the reasons why 600,000 women in Nepal suffered of this, were mostly structural. lack of nutritious food, lack of care and health services, discrimination and cultural practices, and so on. The court was then faced with making a series of orders that went way beyond the area of public health formally into these deeper structural areas. Now, the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. That's partly what this big conference is focusing on. Will they make a difference? There's been an enormous investment in the design of these goals across the world. It's probably the first exercise in global deliberative democracy that we've seen. Now, we must first ask, did the MDGs make any difference if we're going to use the same formula again with the SDGs? Well, in a book I co-edited as a student and partly funded by LEVE, the Millennium Development Goals and Human Rights, we found that the answer was partly and very much conditionally yes. The SDGs partly help in particularly affecting elite opinion and to some extent public opinion, so they shift norms. They create a political incentive for states. They can boast when they're on track with a particular target. And they're increasingly more structural. That's why we ended up now with 169 different targets, because they're trying to influence all the possible determinants of poverty and lack of development and inequality. Sexual and reproductive health is in these particular, in the draft goals issued by the Open-Ended Working Group last year. They were extremely controversial. Countries like Pakistan were threatening to basically pull out of the whole process. They're most likely that they'll be included, so they may potentially make a difference. But arguably, they're going to be dependent on many of the factors that I named. Third, let's just ask, what is change? What do we mean by change? When it comes to sexual and reproductive rights, we need laws. We need the institutionalization of those laws in practices, in bureaucracies, in maternal health centres, with police and so forth. And we need resources, financial, technical, knowledge base. But we also need symbolic changes, symbolic in terms of our attitudes, at the level of public opinion, elite opinion, and bureaucratic opinion, if we're going to have sustainable change. But then we also need to separate the depth of change. Because you can get laws, you can get lots of resources, but if it's not institutionalized, then it's very vulnerable to backlash and to change of priorities. And we've seen that in South Africa. Massive advances on reproductive rights in the 1990s in terms of resources and laws, lots of regression in the 2000s because this wasn't institutionalized. And partly also because public opinion did not come along for the ride. For example, South Africa, to take sexual rights, was the first African country to introduce same-sex marriage, but only 36% of South Africans have a tolerant view of homosexuals. The public opinion on these issues hasn't followed. And so if we want deep, sustainable change, our end goal has to be institutionalization and public opinion. I'll leave that for a moment. Just to finish with some levers of change and some puzzles. So I'm not going to offer you what I think is the ideal theory of change for sexual and reproductive health, but some puzzles. In terms of changing opinion, what's best? Direct representatives? Women talking about abortion? Gay men talking about LGBT rights? Victims of domestic violence talking about sexual violence? Or is it best to have more elite actors, celebrities, politicians talking about these issues in terms of convincing people who may not otherwise be convinced? On the right there, you have a Bollywood celebrity who has really helped mobilize public opinion on LGBT rights in India in the last year. At the same time, on the left, an experimental study showed that when LGBT canvassers went to people's homes and talked about, for example, same-sex marriage, there was likely to be a deeper and sustainable change in that household than if somebody else just made the argument. Another challenge, legitimation versus thermostatic backlash. Sometimes when a powerful actor says, okay, we're going to decriminalize sodomy, or we're going to have abortion, a court or a parliament, the public goes with it. But in other circumstances, groups that are against it mobilize. Or there are some people in the middle think, oh, maybe the courts and parliaments have gone too far too quickly. This is thermostatic reaction. You need to work through carefully what sort of reaction you're going to get. For example, in the US, it's more difficult to get an abortion than it is in Germany. But the US actors moved very quickly and powerfully early on and didn't really anticipate the level of backlash. Sensationalist versus systematic. Do you go for the easy cases? The 12-year-old girl who was raped and denied an abortion? Or do you go for the systemic cases of the 20-year-old woman who doesn't have access to contraception and cannot fulfill her university studies? The first will get you lots of media attention, but only take you so far in actually tackling the deeper systematic problems. Incentives. When are incentives effective in levering change? When are they transformational? When does getting a little bit more money or a little bit more praise make you do the right thing as a bureaucrat or a politician? You're motivated by the norms, but you need a little bit of extra incentive. But when do incentives become perverse? When you pay, for example, midwives or women to give birth at a public health clinic. That may lead to a transformational change in the institution, but as Sidsel showed in some of her work, it may also lead to perverse incentives. You're just going after the numbers and the money rather than the deeper change, or you end up in corruption. That's all from me today. But I'd just like to conclude with where I started, that it's important to ask questions and to keep on asking them if we want to see advancement and not regression on sexual and reproductive rights. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now open up for comments and... No? None? Well, I have one. So, if you're looking forward compared to the MDGs, what's the main challenges you see related to human rights in the new goals compared to the old ones? Are they more human rights based, or are they, which way are they directed?
There's three types of people. There's the person who says the glass is half empty. There are those who say it's half full. And those who say, hey, I ordered a hamburger. I attended the very first conference on the post-2015 agenda back in 2009 in Brussels. And I remember standing up at that conference and saying, we need more rights. All the rights community have been complaining about the lack of rights and ambition in the MDGs. And I said, perhaps we need 10 goals, The designers of the MDGs were in the room, people like Jan van der Meutemal, and he was very critical, and they just laughed at my proposal. Suddenly, in 2014, we have an agenda with 169 targets, 17 goals, lots of rights-focused issues. And I'm like, wow, that's an incredible progress. It's probably too much, actually. And so I'm probably on the half full. But there are others who say it's half empty. It didn't go further. Instead of sexual reproductive health, it should have been sexual and reproductive rights. So you can be critical about that. I don't think it's going to be changed. But you can take the approach of Amnesty International and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2010 and appropriate the new agenda. Read rights into it, infuse it more with a rights perspective, given the language that it's there. One also needs to see the challenge of the new goals. They've moved now from a communication tool, 8 easy goals, okay? Politicians have 10 fingers on their hands, they can probably get up to remembering 8 goals. They don't have 17 fingers on their hand. And so the communicative power of the new SDGs is lost, okay? When no one here, not even the experts on it, can remember it all. But what they're emerging as is a sectoral planning tool, because every sector has their goal. Every sector has a much wider range of targets, whether it's health, gender, water, what there is. And so within the sectors, the SDGs can become powerful tools. And I think at the level, say, of Ministry of Health in a country, but also the level of WHO, these SDGs can be used to, I think, to leverage some degree of change.